guess what? We're going to vacation. We're going to Disney. $10,000 in debt. That's not what God meant. Save for it. Save for vacations. Save for those times to get an idea. Is God's not just saying, give 20% to the church. It's interesting, right? Now, all the tithe of your produce and in that year, because he has no portion or inheritance among you. I know we keep seeing the Levite. Just kidding. If you really believe that, oh my. You don't want me on your vacation, because we'll be doing like stuff from 6 a.m. to 12 midnight. Orphan and the widow who are in your town shall come and eat and be points, you might say. The first rival point is that every 3 years you're to take another tenth of your income, combine your income over 3 years, and take a tenth of that over the 3-year period. Take a tenth of that and do what? Do something special for the widows, the orphans, the Levite, and the strangers. That's what he's saying. So this is inside the culture of what's going on. So every 3rd year, some would say take on average whatever your average income was over 7 years, because they believe that the 6th year you got a double portion. This is what God would do. The 6th year you got a double portion. You're not supposed to plant on the Sabbath, which is the 7th year, and there is nothing to really get on the 8th year, so you wouldn't be able to really harvest anything until the 9th year. So I tend to think that what your average income was over a 7-year stretch, you take 10% of that average and you're giving that to what? Those who need, those who are in need, the orphan, the widow, the stranger, and of course they would add the Levite. So now you're at somewhere between 21 and 23.3%, somewhere in that category. That's God's Old Testament model. But what do we see? We see what? For widows and orphans. What does the New Testament have to say about this? James 1:27. Pure and undefiled religion in the sight of God and Father is this, to visit orphans and widows in their distress. So the New Testament principle is what? We're already taking care of the church, because God mentioned that to the Apostle Paul in 1 Timothy as well as Galatians, what? To take care of your leaders, to take care of your pastors. But in this particular place, we find in James that we are to what? We are to specifically look and care for orphans and widows. Notice how it doesn't say the poor. Interesting. It says orphans and widows. Why? Orphans and widows in this particular setting had really zero capability of earning any income. Not an able-bodied man who runs down to the welfare office because he can apply. That makes me sick. An able-bodied man who says, I can get this, so I'm going to. What in the world is wrong with you? Go to work. Go to work, go to work, go to work. Yet James tells us what? We are to be looking out for the orphans and the widows. So we need to make sure we have a plan, even as a church body. So we have a certain percent of our budget that goes to what? Hands of grace. Goes towards this type of thinking. Goes towards the needs that we see happening in the church. Sometimes even outside the church. So we need to be what? Aware of these things. That's what God's word is telling us. Be aware of these things. So if you're mad at me already, then let's go to 2, because now you'll get even more mad at me. And confess greed and envy. Then you got a problem with greed and envy. If that's a problem for you, you need to begin to uncover that. Say, why am I miserly with my finances? Why am I generous to myself, but I'm miserly to giving? That's a great question, and we need to uncover it. When my wife and I were looking for a home to buy, we had a great realtor, Deb Drowse, awesome realtor. We used her. I think we about pushed her over the deep end because she showed us like 4,000 homes. And so I'm sure that was hard for her. But she found us the home we wanted. We wanted an as-is home. We wanted a fixer-upper because I have some skills that I can use. And so as a result of that, we got a house that has as-is, and I have no problem with that. But as we begin to get involved with remodeling the house, about a year in, maybe a year and a half in, we knew that the house had termites before, and they had been treated for termites, and there was no active termites in the house. And so it was finally time to what? Create and construct a room, a bedroom for my daughter. She had a room upstairs, but we had a bigger plan. We were going to take 2 of the small bedrooms upstairs and create a master bedroom suite, add a bathroom, do all that fun stuff. So the first plan was I got to build a bedroom for my daughter. So I go into the room that was kind of my office. It was a makeshift office. And as you walked in there, it was definitely 1965. That was the year the house was built. The carpet, everything in there was old and smelly. And it was like, yeah, well, this has got to end. Had been a leak. The gutter system had put water straight down and water had seeped in. So it was stuff I had to fix on the outside. Once I got all that, I saw this crack in the sheetrock that I had always seen. I just didn't really pay any much more attention to it. This crack in the sheetrock in the ceiling, whatever, no big deal. I don't really care. But I was also experiencing other things. In our upstairs, there was a squishy part of the floor. So the floor kind of squished a little bit when you would walk in a certain section. We had hardwood floors up there, and it was like, wonder what that's all about. And of course, I didn't spend much time there, so I didn't think about it. I was doing other projects in the house. Finally came time to uncover it. So as I began to take the sheetrock off, I began to, oh my goodness, there is a problem. Thankfully, the past, it's probably 15, 20 years ago, I don't blame, I was okay with an as-is house. I'm okay with it. But as I'm uncovering, I'm like, oh my goodness, correct it. And so I put a brand new top plate in there, I had to put floor joists in. I put 13 brand new 2x8 floor joists, sistered them up, no problem anymore. But it wasn't until I uncovered that I was able to deal with it. Some of us have greed, meaning we're trying to accumulate everything for ourselves. We're trying to accumulate as much as possible, put as much as I can in the bank. I'm trying to accumulate tons. That's not God's model. We'll see that in a second. Or we're envious. This is a real problem. I think I should many times before they succeeded. But many people who are envious are unwilling to do that. They want to stay in this safe spot and pick at those and say, I should have that. Why doesn't God bless me with that? Oh, that's envy. Oh, that's not good. See, envy will keep you in debt to that. You will not be content. You will not be satisfied. The car is never enough. The house is never enough. The bank account is never enough. Going out to eat is not enough. Our vacations aren't enough. Everything is never enough. If that's your way of thinking, you're envious. And you have to uncover that. And you have to confess it. You see, if you confess greed and envy, you will be more loose with your wallet when it comes to generosity. But we got to deal with greed and envy. Jesus deals with this. He asks the question, do you love God more than you love wealth? Do you love God more than wealth? He asks the question in a story, a situation that he gets involved with. Matthew 6:24 makes it very clear you can't serve money and God. You cannot serve wealth and God. You cannot have wealth being your driver and serve God. It's not going to happen, because if wealth is your driver, you will not be generous. And so if that's the case, Jesus meets the rich young ruler, Luke 18. A ruler questioned him, saying, good teacher, what shall I do to inherit eternal life? What should I do to be able to go to heaven? Now, what we don't always understand here is he's not asking this in a sense of like humility. He's really asking in a sense of pride. There's an ego attached to this, because you'll see he's getting ready to lie. So Jesus says to him, well, you know the commandments, right? You know the 10 commandments. And obviously there's 613 commandments, but you know those. And what does he say? The rich young ruler says, all these things I have kept from my youth. Wrong. You're a liar. No one has. Right? The book of Romans, Paul really details this for us. To say the law, all of the Old Testament, those first 5 books of the Old Testament, the law is what? It's there to show us where we're wrong. The Bible calls it, or Paul calls it, a taskmaster. It's there to point and prod and push against you until it finds your weak spot and reveals you to be a fraud. It reveals you to be a sinner. And what's the other thing? The blessing is it reveals your need for saving. It reveals your need that I can't do this on my own. I can't get to heaven on my own. See, the rich young ruler's thinking he can. I've kept all the commandments. And so then Jesus says, when Jesus heard this, he said to him, oh yeah, I know this guy all too well. I know where his spot is. One thing you still lack, Mr. Rich Young Ruler. Sell all that you possess and distribute it to the poor. And you shall have treasure in heaven, and come follow me. Ooh, Jesus hit him right in the sweet spot. Why? Because he recognized that this man was pride and arrogant. Why? Because he had based all of his value, all of his influence, everything that he had in his identity was attached to his wealth. It was because he was wealthy that he had confidence. It was because he was wealthy that he had influence. It's because he was this rich young ruler that he had value in the town and in the world. And Jesus says, I want you to subtract all that value because all of that means nothing in the next life. It means nothing. Take it all away. Give it to the poor. Follow me. We'd probably have another book in the Bible. We'd probably know the rich young ruler's name. We'd probably have maybe a gospel that he wrote. But no, what do we have? We have the end of his story, which is this. But when he had heard these things, he became very sad, for he was extremely rich. Sad story, right? But we have that same mindset if we're unwilling to be generous. Because the idea was not for him to become poor. The idea was what? To release him from the chains of his wealth. He was chained to it. And he needed to be released from it. Because if he was following all the law, he would have understood all of this wealth I have, God has given me the ability to make it. So what does God do? God will what? You give it and he gives it back. I'm sure the rich young ruler could have given it all away, and God would have given him a new idea for business, something new to do, and he'd earn it all back and be able to give generously again. That's God's model. But what? He was unwilling to trust in God's model. He trusted in the almighty wealth that he had. Continue on. Secondly, do I seek enjoyment and contentment from my wealth or my walk with God? This is the second question that we need to ask ourselves, is do I love God more than money? Rich young ruler, he loves money more than God. So we notice that he was greedy. Secondly is this, do I seek enjoyment and contentment from my wealth or my walk with God? This is where envy comes in. Look at Hebrews 13:5. Make sure that your character is free from the love of money. Not from money. Some people get that confused. That, people who have lots of money, they're greedy. No, they're not. They probably have a good business plan, or they're using something that has produced immense value. There's very, very much, there's sinful people in our world that do sinful things and earn great income because they're doing it in a sinful way. And they get that income. But just because someone has money doesn't mean that they have a love of money or are greedy. But what? Being content with what you have. See, this is the enemy of envy, contentment. That's why the Bible tells us what? Godliness with contentment is great gain. You see, if you are content, then you're not trying to keep up with anyone else. You're not trying to wish that you had someone else's life. You're not trying to, if I could just have that, if I could just have that. All that does is paralyze you from moving forward in your own life. Don't be the guy, don't be the gal that lives 25 years in envy of other people. And then you have nothing as a result of it. You work some dead-end job or something for 25 years wishing you had what other people have. Get education, get some certifications, get some licenses, get out there, start a business, do something great. Get after it. Stop thinking about everybody else and what they have. You get after what God has for you. Pray, ask God. God, do you have a business you want me to start? Do you have something else you want me to do? I have these educational aspirations? Well, think about it. Pray about it. Let him lead you. Don't stay down here envious of everybody else. Get after it. But we have another story, Luke 12. Then he said to them, beware and be on guard against every form of greed. For not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. So now he's going to explain what that means. And he told them a parable, saying the land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and all my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, anytime people start talking in third person, they got a problem. Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. And I could just see Satan's arm puppeting those words through the rich man's lips. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you. We see another story of this in Luke chapter 16, the rich man and Lazarus. Rich man walks past Lazarus every day and does nothing for the crippled, does nothing for the person who's in need, does nothing for someone who has a problem and has a need. And the rich man, ends up in Hades, the bad side of Hades. And what does he say to Abraham? Send me back so I can tell my brothers how foolish I was. That I was trusting in riches. I was trusting in my money. I was trusting in all of my wealth. I did it wrong. I need to tell my brothers. And Abraham says, they got the prophets to listen to. Oh, what a sad day that must have been. Living in Hades, undergoing torment, and now not being able to tell the truth to your brothers. That's a sad day. But here in this story, we see the same attitude. This attitude of what? Greediness. This attitude of, I don't need to care about anybody else. And now, what does the parable say? And now, who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. This storing up treasure for oneself, some preachers would have you believe that that's the inheritance part. That's you storing up treasure so you have an inheritance. That's unbiblical, and that's a moron as far as I'm concerned. But the idea is that they're giving a portion of their income. They are generous with a portion of their income to God's kingdom. And then God gives you the ability to build an inheritance. See, when you get it right, he gives you that ability. Why? Because your contentment is in check. Your envy and greed gets checked at the door. And you're content. And you're thinking about the future. That's why I have, my kids, many of them, when they were younger, they would make fun of the car I drive. Like, Dad, man, isn't it time to upgrade that? Like, no, because I'm thinking about something else, bro. And you can't understand that right now. And that's okay, right? You're naive. You're a kid. But I'm thinking about the future, right? Not about a nice ride. So it's a different thinking process. For me, I'd have to make a decision. Some of you can enjoy those things, and that's great. I think it's wonderful. It's even better. But for me, I have a decision to make. Drive that car or give towards the inheritance or be generous. For me, it's a decision like that, so it's an easy one. But what do we see in here? We're seeing this treasure that is being built up is not for self. And see, if we're not being generous, all we're doing is being greedy. We're just, that game called Hungry Hippo always sticks in my head. It's to what? To get the most and take, and sometimes we would punch each other in the arm to get them to stop pressing the button. I mean, we would cheat and I'll do all sorts of things. But that's how it works in the real world too. Got to be aware of that. It's not just trying to accumulate. It's accumulating so I can be generous and I can build an inheritance. Look at 1 Timothy 6. It's good. Instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, to be generous and ready to share. If I don't instruct you to be generous, if I don't instruct you to be ready to share, I'm at fault as a pastor. I know many pastors don't even want to touch on money. They don't want to talk about it. Why? Because it's wrong in their own life. That's why. Right? If you see something I'm not willing to preach on, it's because I got a problem with it in my own life. So I got to deal with my own stuff first. Right? I got to deal with my heart. God's got to deal with my heart. Say, are you willing to do these things? Are you willing to take these things to heart? Am I willing to do that? I got to be willing to do that in order to properly preach the passage. Lastly is this. We will then practice a spirit-led, purpose-driven generosity. You can certainly follow the Old Testament model. I believe I gave good New Testament support for giving to the local church. Because some people think, oh, I just need to be generous and give to everything else except for the local church. But I believe you need to prioritize the local church. And if you stick with a 10% donating to Sayre Bible Church, you will be extreme. Goes on in America right now. We are the average church. If you take our giving units, about 200 or so giving units, and you average by what the average income is, household income is around in this area, we fall in the category between 2 and 3%. That's where we're at. Now, I have no idea what any of you give. I don't want to know, don't need to know, could care less. All I'm saying is that we are average. We are the average church. And typically it's a few giving a lot and a lot of people giving very little. And that's the way it has been for probably 40 years right now. As far as I can look back on Barna, that's been like the giving average. So why not Sayre Woods be above average? We could do more if we were tithing. I know that churches have put this in place and have given tithing challenges, and people were truly amazed at the potential income that the church could have. Sometimes, I know for me, sometimes we're thinking too small. Because it's like, well, this is all we have, so we want to stay within that. Instead of teaching generosity, instead of teaching the tithing, the spirit of tithing principle. You see, if we all band together and we give 10%, we'll blow the budget out of the water. We're able to do a lot more, be able to help a lot more people, be able to meet felt needs, be able to share gospel on a greater scale, send more missionaries. I mean, these are all parts of generosity. But if we're going to be generous, then we need to what? Practice a spirit-led, purpose-driven generosity. So where do we see? Proverbs 3:9. Honor the Lord from your wealth and from the first of all your produce. Here's where most of us get into trouble. We first take care of all the things that our lifestyle demands. Then we see what's left over, and then we give. And that's not the principle of the scriptures. The first, not what's left over. Because in essence, what you're doing is you're saying, my lifestyle is more important than my generosity. So my generosity to self is more important than generosity to the church. And so my lifestyle demands this amount, and sometimes I'm able to give. That's a problem. That's a sinful mindset that keeps you in greed and envy. And it keeps you in lifestyle envy and greed. What needs to happen is the lifestyle needs to begin to decrease. When my lifestyle decreases, I create margin so I can honor God with my wealth instead of continually honoring myself. This is how I lived as a young man. I honored myself. I was like, yeah, buddy, I got that. I earned that income, and I'm doing this now. I did it. It was my strength. It was my thought, and I'm going to take it, and I'm going to use it. That's a greed mindset. That's a lifestyle mindset. That didn't move me to having lots and lots of money in the bank. It moved me to creating debt. That's what it moved me to. And so I had to be confronted with that and deal with that. So now what do? We honor the Lord right away. Before even any bills are paid, we honor the Lord. And you'll notice if you do this, if you take 10% of your income and give it to the church, you'll notice that for some of us, our lifestyle might need to change drastically. And so sometimes it takes 3, 6, 9, 12 months to get there. But we need to have this mindset of first, I give first. Deuteronomy 26, we don't have time to read all of this, but as you read all of it, the idea is that you're taking your first fruits. The thinking is fruits, the very first. He didn't eat anything, this scripture says he didn't eat anything, didn't do anything first, he gave of his first fruits. This is the problem if you go back to the beginning and you see Cain and Abel. What do you see from Abel? You see Abel giving of the first and the best of his flock. That's what he did. Because some people say, it was a blood sacrifice. He should have gotten something from Abel. That's secondary. Primary is this. The Bible tells us that Cain brought some of his produce. What does that mean? That means he made sure that he was taken care of first. He made sure that himself, he was okay, and his family was okay. Now I have some left over. I'll bring it to God. And God's saying, unacceptable. I don't need your leftovers. I want what's first. Because why? Deuteronomy says, I'm the one who gave you the ability to make the wealth. I gave you the ability to do it. And so you should what? In turn, be generous with it. Cain, what did he do? He became resentful. He became angry. And then what did he do? He slew his brother. Watch out. Some of us do that in our hearts and in our minds. We get angry and resentful and mad. Because Pastor Dan's saying something that I don't practice. I'm going to show him I ain't giving nothing. I will say this, you're only hurting yourself. Just humble yourself. Look at the scriptures. This idea of the first fruits is a biblical model. The other part of this was what? He wanted them to bring it as they gave. He wanted them to remember where they came from. See, God's model was also, I want you to give because it's mine to begin with. And I want you to give the first fruits so you remember where it came from. And then I want to remind you where I have brought you. See, I have brought you from slavery. I brought you from the Egyptian slavery. And you need to remember that, and you need to teach it to your kids. And for us, it's what? We were brought out of the sin of slavery to sin. God has saved us from that. He saved our souls so we walk differently. We can now be generous. And we remember our testimony, what God has done. If you remember your story, if you remember the crap that you were involved with, if you remember how awful you were, and God, what? Loved you and saved you, you remember that, you will have no problem at all being generous. You're like, I only have this because God's given it to me. I should become more like a river than like the Dead Sea. Some of us think of the Dead Sea as our financial plan. Let's get fat and create a big Dead Sea. That is not God's model for finances. It's a river. It comes to us, we invest, we prepare for the future, we create an inheritance, and we die, and we go be with Jesus. That's what we do. And what? We have opportunity to make a difference while we're here on earth. Continuing on, we see this. I will employ the principle of the first fruits. So whenever you get paid twice a month, you get paid twice every other week, you get paid once a month, you get paid once a year, you get paid once a job. It doesn't matter. But whenever you get that pay, you slice 10% off of that pay and say, this is God's. This is the first fruits. And you might say, well, I can't do that right now. because my lifestyle, I've created a bad lifestyle. Okay. So what do? We plan to subtract from your lifestyle. That's what you plan to do. But if it's only 1%, if it's 2%, if it's 5%, whatever it is, you commit to that. First and foremost, you commit to the first fruits. That is God's model. So I will give first, and my lifestyle will suffer as a result of it. But you know what God does? Your lifestyle suffers, and all of a sudden, contentment begins to flood into your soul. Satisfaction, contentment.